Okay, so continuing on with our biodiversity lecture series, we are now going to focus on strategies to protect species and what it means to be a threatened or endangered species. On the slide in front of you is a list of threatened and endangered species, just a few of them, including the Florida manatee, the northern spotted owl, which exists in northwestern United States. It's considered threatened, the gray wolf, the Florida panther, and Bannerman's turaco, which is located and found in Africa. Some extinct species are listed at the bottom of the screen, which have been mentioned previously, including the passenger pigeon, the great auk, the dodo, the dusky seaside, and a bird found in Madagascar known as the apornis, if I'm saying that correctly. So, some strategies for protecting species include doing the approach from the species approach, where you protect the species from premature extinction by identifying that species as a threatened or endangered species and then protecting habitats associated with that species. The laws actually put into place that the species are legally protected and nobody can hunt or fish or harvest that species. It also involves managing the habitat and trying to propagate those species in captivity scenarios and possibly reintroducing those species into suitable habitats, like what was done for the gray wolf. The ecosystem approach is another way to protect our biodiversity, and the goal is to protect populations of species in their natural habitats and identify habitats that are considered critical habitats because they're home for species that are experiencing population declines. So the strategy here is to preserve sufficient area of habitat in different types of biomes and aquatic systems. And by protecting the habitat, you then provide a place for different species to live. So, ways to protect habitat are by having the government purchase land and set it aside as part of maybe the national park system or the national wildlife refuge system and so on. So that's one way. Or through private purchase and setting up land trusts. So for example, the Nature Conservancy is a large nonprofit organization that works with private landowners to purchase the lands and set them aside for preservation purposes. This stops those lands from being further developed as urban sprawl encroaches upon a specific area or converted from their existing land use into some other form of land use. Hence, the habitat is maintained and protected. The other way of dealing with protecting our ecosystems is by eliminating or reducing the number of invasive species that are impacting our native species. Also, setting up protected areas to sustain native species, and then ecosystems where we've seen environmental degradation occur either through pollution or habitat fragmentation or potentially through invasive species, working on those areas specifically to restore those ecosystems. So some examples to give you in terms of how we've tried to use the ecosystem approach here in the United States is with our National Wildlife Refuge System. We have about 75% wetland refuges that have been established throughout the United States, and these areas see over 40 million American visitors per year. Many refuge systems do allow mining and oil drilling and off-road vehicles, so there's a need to maybe further protect those refuge systems in order to maintain the ecosystem. I mentioned the Endangered Species Act previously in earlier short video lectures, but I want to go into some more detail on it in this short video lecture. The Endangered Species Act is legislation that was passed by Congress in 1973, and it's overseen by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The act was amended in 1982 and 1988, and it made it illegal for Americans to import or trade in any product that's made from an endangered or threatened species, unless it's used for an approved scientific purpose to enhance the survival of that species. So this really focuses on stopping the illegal trading of species that have declined in population. The law basically says that you cannot legally hunt, trap, or harass the threatened and endangered species. This also restricts federally funded development. So a government project for a bridge expansion or a highway expansion or perhaps a new building for government agency offices cannot happen on lands which contain threatened and endangered species unless there's a special plan that's been set up to relocate those species to a different area and deem that there would be no impact on those species. The other part of the Act is to institute recovery plans for certain species that have been identified as endangered and to institute habitat protection for the critical habitats related to those endangered species. As of the year 2000, there were over 503 animals, 774 plants listed as being endangered. There were 211 animals and 168 plants designated as threatened. A total of 1,656 species listed for protection under the United States Endangered Species Act. There are still about 3,600 species that need to be evaluated, some of which are targeted as candidate species that may be added to the list in the near future. Now, I mentioned that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service oversees the Endangered Species Act, but we also have the National Marine Fisheries Service that identifies and lists threatened and endangered species in our marine environments, or oceans. Each state has their own framework that they use to protect species as well. And in Pennsylvania, we have the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and specifically within the DCNR, we have the Pennsylvania Natural Diversity Inventory that provides an inventory of threatened and endangered species and critical habitats within Pennsylvania. An agency that does quite a bit of research regarding threatened and endangered species is the Biological Research Division of the United States Geological Survey. They have instituted a program known as the National Biological Information Structure, or the NBII, and it's intended to be an electronic gateway to biological information maintained by local, state, and federal agencies. So it's kind of like a consortium of data at all levels of government within the United States. One of our most effective presidents historically in setting up habitat protection was President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1903, he established the first U.S. wildlife refuge at Pelican Island off of Florida's Atlantic coast to protect the brown pelican from overhunting and loss of habitat. Before the end of Roosevelt's first term, he created 49 more wildlife refuges. Now, 508 national wildlife refuges exist throughout the United States. The guidelines haven't been fully established for the management within these national wildlife refuge systems, as they have for other public lands, but it's being worked on. There's a continuing pressure to open up these national wildlife refuge locations for mining or oil and gas development. Currently, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska has been pressed for about 20 years to allow oil drilling to occur within its boundaries. Continually, the United States Congress is denying this action and disallowing for it to occur. So it's possible in the foreseeable future that the Endangered Species Act could be modified and adjusted to basically state that for all wildlife refuges that oil drilling and mining are not permitted. Now, because of some of these protection measures that have been put into place, we've actually seen some recovery of certain species, including the American alligator and the gray wolf, as well as the bald eagle. So these are success stories that have happened since the passage of this law back in 1973. There are also international entities that work on protecting species that are seeing a population decline at an international level. One is called the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, or CITES, C-I-T-E-S, and I'll discuss that more on the next slide. Another is called the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. each of these entities work together to protect threatened and endangered species around the world. There's a link here that takes us to a list of endangered species within the United States, and this website itself allows you to click on each one of these categories to find out which species are listed as endangered or threatened. So we're going to click on mammals, and you can see that it includes a list of 95 mammal species specific to the United States, and it designates what region they're located in, and if they're listed as endangered for a letter E or T for threatened. And this is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife website that helps track the list of species that are considered endangered or not. There's also a link at the bottom of the screen that provides an overall listing regarding endangered and threatened species. So, for example, amphibians. In the U.S., there are 20 endangered amphibians, 15 threatened amphibians, for a total of 35 species. Internationally, there are considered to be 8 endangered amphibians, 1 threatened, for a total of 9 species. Total species in the amphibian category that are threatened or endangered are 44 species. And then we can get more detail on specific species that have recovery plans in place where they're trying to help those species numbers come back. There are more birds that are considered endangered than amphibians. Overall, in the United States, 102 bird species versus 35 amphibian species, and 235 species of birds internationally, for a total of 337 bird species that are considered endangered or threatened. For corals, we're just now evaluating this group in terms of endangered and threatened status as a result of the coral bleaching that's going on. In terms of clams, it looks like we have a total of 91 species throughout the world that are considered threatened and endangered, and fish, there are 193 species. So as we go down this list, mammals is at 378 species, so it appears that we have more mammals around the world as being threatened and endangered than we do birds, fish, and amphibians. Please notice that there are 12 endangered arachnids or spiders in the United States, and none are listed as being threatened or endangered at the international level. Overall, this chart is depicting that in the United States we have 714 species identified as threatened or endangered, and globally 1,388 species. So it's a good website to go to. So I focused on the animal totals coming across this column, this row, and I didn't mention the reptiles, so let's just backtrack a little bit here. In terms of reptiles, there are 45 species in the United States classified as endangered and threatened, and 95 species internationally, for a total of 140 reptile species around the world that are considered to be threatened or endangered. Now, for the most part, I've focused on animals, but there's another category here for plants, including conifers, ferns, flowering plants, and lichen. Notice that there's a distinct difference in the numbers listed for the United States and internationally. It appears that the U.S. has done more work with tracking population numbers of specific plants and listing them as threatened or endangered as compared to globally. So, on this list, there's over 898 threatened and endangered plant species in the United States, but only one is recognized internationally, for a total of 899 species. Overall, we have 945 plant species in the world, of which 942 are designated as threatened and endangered in the U.S. This compares to animals at 1,388. So total number of threatened and endangered species, plants, and animals is over 2,000 worldwide.